individually with one another. And perhaps we'll do a little bit of a recap on Tuesday night's session for those who weren't with us, and for us to connect a little bit with the message of Laudato Si that was shared before we start to explore together the implications for us and begin that dialogue. I'd also like to acknowledge that there were some questions we didn't answer last time, so we might just go into those after that. And I'd like to screen share with you now so that we can recap together. So you would remember this question if you were with us on Tuesday: how can we bring Laudato Si to life at home, in our parish, in our community, in the Archdiocese, nationally and globally? That's the theme for our question tonight as well. We spent a little bit of time exploring Laudato Si. So I'm just going to flick through those as a visual reminder for those who are there. We began by looking at this gorgeous invitation from Pope Francis through St. Francis of Assisi, inviting us to see that the relational space we're called to hold with each other as creation, with our common home, is like a sister with whom we share our life, and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. We then had a look at the central question of Laudato Si, which is, what kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children who are now growing up? We explored a little bit of chapter 1, the problems that we face, and had a frank look at the facts about what's happening to our common home. We then had a look at the gospel of creation in chapter 2, and 3 particular theological imperatives were explored. We then had the opportunity to look at the human roots of the crisis, which really highlights the way in which we see the world as being either problematic if it's a technocentric focus, focusing on technology saving us in a fragmented worldview, or perhaps, and both, an anthropocentric worldview, holding humanity only as the most important dimension of life. We then had a look at integral ecology as a paradigm through which we can live our lives and from which we can operate to bring healing to the relationships that we're in and that we're called to have holistically with the earth, with each other, and with our Creator. And then we had a look at the direction Pope Francis invites us to take in terms of dialogue and action. And finally, ecological education and spirituality as being a really important priority to enable the changes that are required for us to make these healing changes. So we finished on a note of an invitation to dialogue, and there were some questions that were posed, several of them which were answered in the session and that are in the recording, but there were a couple we didn't get to explore more fully. And Robbie kindly sent those to me. I don't know if they're at hand for you there, Robbie, but I remember the first one being...
Yes, I've put them in the chat area.
Oh, have you? I've got the...
So there were, we received subsequently a question from Mari, but the 2 questions that we didn't have time for that we received were from Peter Johnston and from Lucy. So those are both in the chat if people wish to see the wording there. But you've probably got those, Jacqui.
Yes. Would you mind just reminding us what the first question is? From
Peter, despite the very necessary attention to the Royal Commission findings on our Church's inadequacies, is not Laudato Si fundamental to the mission of the Church? Do you think that the challenges of LS will be addressed adequately at the Plenary Council?
Thanks for the question reminder. Yes, that really is an important question, because my sense for us as Church is that if we can hold the message of Laudato Si going forward in the way that we are Church, then we will be able to integrate in ways that we previously have not been. So the Royal Commission is urgent and it absolutely needs attention. But actually, if we hold an integral perspective in responding to that, how much better our response will be. And the same with the Plenary Council. Then if we hold an integral worldview, then we can actually achieve a sense of interconnectedness in ways of being church that we haven't been able to yet as well. So I am sorry to say that I think our uptake of Laudato Si has been painfully slow. It is being spurred on by the good work of Pope Francis, the Dicastery of Integral Human Development, and particularly the Ecology Office that Father Joshua Carethodum holds as a key animator of this work, working with partners around the world and inspiring us to go forward. I don't believe that our plenary council process has taken hold of Laudato Si as an integral framework through which to respond. And so I think what's come through in the dialogues in the first phase was feedback about the importance of listening to creation, of responding to creation holistically with humans as part of it. But I think our themes that came out of that first phase lend themselves to being seen through an integral worldview perspective and responded to. But I'm not sure that it has been taken up centrally. And I'm paying attention to what comes out. And I noticed that we've just received news that the dates for the meetings of the Plenary Council are pushed back by 12 months, which gives more time for that discernment and reflection. And I hope that all of us who are called to participate in this can continue to bring Laudato Si to bear in the way that we respond personally, but in the way our organisations, parishes and institutions respond to. So I think we've got a long way to go is in essence my response, and I don't think it's fully being taken up. But that's really what perhaps our lifetime journey might be about. So let's not shy away from that challenge. And the second question, Robbie, I
From
think
Lucy was, with the so-called wet markets at the origin of COVID-19, I am troubled by mainstream media's use of this euphemism with its ongoing hiding of the suffering of animals at the heart of the global problem we face. Does this also strike you?
yes, it does. I think that root cause about anthropocentrism or human-centeredness means that sadly other creatures that we share this planet with have actually been seen as inferior and not as worthy in, of being looked after. And I think this is a huge problem we have to address very quickly, because industrialized animal husbandry and consumption and poverty, by not sharing the earth's goods, means that people have had to continue to resort to bushmeat, and sometimes that's traditional practice, and when it's done appropriately it's safe. But when people are pushed to the brink of needing to go into ecosystems and that overlap between animals and humans means that, you know, a pandemic like this can be caused by zoonoses jumping across species, then it's clear that we are causing problems with the intrinsic workings of ecosystems. So lifting up and paying attention to this message in Laudato Si about the intrinsic worth and value of creatures is actually a really important imperative. Theologically, it's clear, but practically we have to make those changes. So we're invited to see ourselves on the same level as community, living community of God's creation. And to heal that, it's about being in right relationship with God's creatures, with the ecosystems that we're part of. And I think it's up to each of us through our conscious decisions to choose wisely, how we befriend the creatures of this earth, how we respect them if we do choose to eat them, and at what level and in what ways we choose for that to take place, because we are able to make very ethical decisions, and it's up to us to do that. And as a community, of course, we can work together to create changes through legislation and through the way farming practices take place. And supply demand with food is a very powerful thing. So opting for, you know, food choices that are sustainable, that are organic, biodynamic farming, cooperative models of supply, and regenerative farming, all of those things are available to us. So we can up the increase of those. We can choose to eat less meat, and we can spread that message of the bonds of love and creatureliness with our families and friends. So there's a lot we can do in that space. So thank you for those. Was there another question, Robbie, or should we move now?
Let's just take one more question, and this
Sure.
came from Mari. Has an invitation been extended to the many other religions and environmental activist groups to connect in some way? It's a whole world problem. It needs a whole world solution.
Great. I love that framing of the whole world problem and solution, and the fact that our faiths have got a significant contribution to make, because Pope Francis sees that himself in bringing together world faith leaders in the month before he launched Laudato Si. He invited them to the Vatican where they gathered, and he shared with them his intention of releasing this new teaching on Laudato Si and integral ecology for Catholics, for Christians, for everybody. But he implored them also to come out with their own teaching in light of what is happening to our world today. And many statements and declarations then came out. So at a world level, there's been significant leadership shown through the faith traditions on the planet. There's the Parliament of World Religions that's taken up a whole focus on creation and caring for it, and being about dialogue and action to promote that through its meetings, papers, and events. And it's contributing also to the Vatican COVID task force in the working group on ecology. So the voices of faiths is part of the global conversation. And importantly, at national and local levels, there's much we can do to feed into that, to enable it. Tonight's gathering and Tuesday night's gathering has come about by virtue of an ecumenical gathering that took place at St Clement's Gaylong a couple of years ago. That there's also interfaith work that happens through the Faith Ecology Network, through the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change. There are many ways through which you can engage interfaith and ecumenically, as well as within our own church circles. So yes, that's a huge area of work, and if you feel called to it, please go for it, because your voice is needed, your contribution is valued. And if you want to know how to make those connections and you're not sure, just reach out through Roger to myself for that. There's social media that's active on it as well. So yes, so thank you for those questions. They're really wonderful questions. And I think that your questions, you can add them to the chat box tonight for further conversation should we have time in tonight's session. We'd also like to invite you to have dialogue within your own chat rooms tonight. So one of the features of this conference setting with Zoom, Roger may have mentioned, is to enable that, and we'll do that shortly. But before we do, I'd like to just talk a little bit about this word dialogue that Pope Francis gives us as the first action that we should take in responding to Laudato Si, and just explore it a little bit so that we're in a frame of understanding it before we go into the breakout rooms. This work of integral ecology is important to all of us. I think we're invited to become experts in dialogue at the same time as we're being invited to change our worldview. So that's not easy to do, but we need to do it, because without an integrated way of seeing the world, seeing God's creation, seeing ourselves as part of it, we're going to continue to fragment and cause problems by bringing a particular uh, set of thinking and practice to bear. So let's just open ourselves up to what integral ecology is as well. And one of the questions last week said, how do we picture this? And I said, I've got a really good slide that attempts to do this in some ways that I want to share with you. So this is one slide that attempts to show how interconnected the spheres are of the social, the economic, the spiritual, the natural, the cultural, the ethical, the political. And of course, there are other spheres that we could add in here, but that's enough in one picture, I think. So to see how interrelated everything is, how it overlaps in the centre, and how we're called to be able to understand, to develop our depth of understanding, the significance of these spheres, and how they're interrelated all the time, so that we can move around within a worldview that explores it all, that attempts to respond holistically to the challenges we face. What Pope Francis says about knowledge and this paradigm for the new dialogue is that fragmented and isolated knowledge must be integrated into a broader vision that considers an interrelationship between ecosystems and between the various spheres of social interaction. So it's no longer appropriate just to come out of a social justice mentality that doesn't include the ecological, and vice versa, to come out of an ecological that doesn't include humanity in that, the beauty and the brokenness of it. That relates also to any sphere of work that we're involved in, whether it be political, economic, church and pastoral work. All of it is situated within these overlapping spheres and this model of integral ecology. In terms of education, we're called to see that all of us can educate about having an integral ecological worldview. And the call is for our efforts at education to be much more adequate and effectual. So Pope Francis says that our efforts won't be adequate or effectual unless we strive to promote a new way of thinking about human beings, about our life, and about the life of creation, about society and our relationship with nature. Otherwise, the paradigm of consumerism will continue to advance with the help of media and the highly effective workings of the market. So really, the solution to all the problems we face must start with this integral ecological worldview. A little bit more about the call for transformative education before we look at dialogue. The ecological crisis is also a summons to a profound interior conversion. So it needs to start with our own hearts, with our own way of thinking. We need to experience a conversion, a change of heart. The ecological conversion needed to bring about lasting change is also a community conversion. So it's not good enough for us to just be ecologically converted in our own selves. It really is about now working for systemic change in our communities. So this involves our parishes, our institutions, as well as our secular world institutions of the body politic, the economic systems that need to change. So how can we better reflect the intent of Laudato Si? Well, when we look at the ways in which we live, the sectoral responses, and the kinds of initiatives that can help us, we know that Laudato Si offers various ways in which we can perceive this. We can look at simple things in our footprint around energy use and water, around waste production, and the landscapes that we're part of. We can look at our liturgical practices and Catholic social teaching. We can look at how we're engaging with one another in our parishes and in our communities. So there's three broad areas on the left of this slide in the circle that suggest that we need to work in all of these areas. Community relationships and dialogue, the religious and spiritual dimensions and the underpinnings from our tradition, and with other faiths, and of course the ethical resource use that we're all involved in. This comes from a model that was developed when I was working with Catholic Earth Care Australia around 6 key areas. So there's a lot more detail in the model on the right, and it calls us to see that we need to be in a process of constantly learning from how we're acting, and the feedback from that helps inform our next actions. That we need to see that we need to evaluate through looking at our ways of living, and that we can measure those against some targets and some measures. And you would have seen that Roger emailed you a new plan for Laudato Si action in the world. So that's setting up some new ways to work together as a whole church globally, which I think is a fantastic thing to come out of the dicastery right now in response to the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si in Laudato Si week.
Jacqui, that document was very difficult for some of our people to download. So we appreciated you sending that clean skin version that we can have for our own use only with the content, without all the graphics.
Oh, good. So the text, I hope, will be helpful, and getting a graphic copy to you that's not such a large file is the next step. So it's emerging, but I'm really pleased that you can have it at this time, that it can stimulate some thinking for you and some dialogue tonight, hopefully too. So let's go into our breakout rooms in a moment. I just want to share a little bit about dialogue. So the word itself, when we look at it, dia means through, and logos translates to meaning or word. So in essence, whenever we're participating in dialogue, it's about a flow of meaning being created. So that dialogue can be dialogue with self, dialogue with humans, one another, dialogue with creation itself. So being in dialogue with trees when you're going past them on a walk, being in dialogue with the earth as you're walking on it, being in dialogue with any of the elements in creation, including other creatures. But it can also be dialogue with our Creator God, dialogue through prayer, and dialogue by just being and acknowledging that we're part of this amazing cosmos. The created cosmos, and together with the cosmic Christ. So dialogue has many ways of being experienced, as I'm sure you're familiar with. The intention of dialogue, as Bill Isaac says, is to reach new understandings, and in doing so, to form a totally new basis from which to think and act. He says, we do not merely try to reach agreement, we try to create a context from which many new agreements might come. And we seek to uncover a base of shared meaning that can greatly help coordinate and align our actions with our values. And this is something that's in Laudato Si as well. Pope Francis talks about the need for us to recover our values, because at the moment, a lot of the practices that we're involved in the human systems of consumption, production, and economy, for example, are not aligning with our core values, as Catholic social teaching tells us about human dignity when we've got so many people below the dignity line, about living in solidarity with creation. A little bit more about this word dialogue, and it relates well to the word, of course, conversation. Conversation is an interesting word because it relates closely with ecological conversion as well. By this, I'm drawing on Michael Cowan and Bernard Lee in their book, where they say talking happens a lot. It is often monologue. Conversation is rarer by far. It is always dialogue. No one takes leave of a real conversation the same as when one entered into it. Our conversations create us. Conversation and risk and conversion belong together, they say. Conversation is dangerous, therefore, to anyone unwilling to embrace or at least to accept transformation. That conversion and conversation are related in meaning and etymology is no fluke, they're saying here. True conversation always puts conversants at risk because you cannot truly converse without risk of conversion. So when we enter into dialogue or conversation, we're invited rather to suspend our usual patterns of thinking, of feeling, of judgment, and to open ourselves up to really listen and hear what's coming from creation, what's coming from another human being, what's coming from our Creator. The usual patterns in conversation that you might be familiar with is that our way of seeing and feeling and thinking often invites us to go into a space of debate and dialogue. And this is important at times because we do often need to defend our values, to defend our practice, and to go into skillful discussion and debate has a rightful place in our parliamentary processes, in schools where we're encouraging debate to understand the lines of argument and the need to come to discerned conclusions. But dialogue is something different. It is inviting us to suspend that usual pattern of defending our understandings and to open ourselves up to understand another's perspective. Another way that helps illustrate what happens in dialogue is through the way that we bring our skills of listening. So just take a moment to look at this, because if we listen from our usual patterns and habits, then we just simply download information and we listen for perhaps what's reconfirming our own thoughts, our own opinions and judgments. But if we listen a bit more deeply from the outside with an open mind, we might start to notice differences in what we're hearing, what we're noticing, what we're experiencing. And this is where we pay attention to new information, new data that's coming in. If we listen more deeply still from within, then we're invited to listen empathically. We're actually invited, therefore, to listen with an open heart and to see through another's eyes, to step into the shoes of another. A more deeper listening style is to listen from source. And here, this image comes from a secular image through Otto Scharmer's work of Theory U. We can replace the word source with Creator God, our loving Creator. Listening from that space means that we open our will. We surrender our personal ego self will to God's will. And therefore, we're actually leaning in to listen to what is wanting to emerge from God for the future. So we're connecting to a greater whole. Tonight, that might be too much for us to do at that deepest level. It's something that takes a lot of practice, and if we did a little bit more of that together, we could get to that as a group. But tonight, I'd just like to encourage you to open your mind, to open your heart, to listen from outside of yourself and to listen from within your heart as we ask this question of one another. How can we bring Laudato Si to life? To bring this to life in the context of your own life, in your own home context, you might like to share something about that. How can you bring it to life perhaps in your parish context? Some of you might like to reflect on that in the breakout room. For others, it might be about a school or educational context in which you'd like to reflect on bringing Laudato Si to life. And for others, it might be about the church. How do we bring it to life in our archdiocesan context, in our institutional context, nationally or globally? So you can choose how you'd like to have the dialogue. Be open to one another, coming in from another perspective, coming in at another level of this question. And we're going to take 10 minutes in the breakout room now So there'll be groups of 4 roughly. Roger's going to guide us in that process of just pressing a button and inviting us to go into a breakout room. When you see it come up on the screen, just click into that, and
There'll be a couple of 5s.
That's fine. 5 people. Thanks, Roger. We're back.
Yes, I think everybody's back now. That went a little longer than 10 minutes, but was about 11 and a half minutes.
Great. And hopefully everybody had the chance to share in that time and to listen to one another. And as you could probably tell, there's great diversity in responses. I was in one of the groups where we traversed a whole range of areas of our lives, and the broader story of spirituality, which is so deep in this, was the note that we finished on, which was just great. So, you know, hopefully this sense of dialogue that we're having tonight, this experience, helps us feel more grounded in being able to have the dialogue going forward. You know, these experiences can help us feel a bit more confident about raising what comes up in Laudato Si for us, and talking about any of these topics and ways into conversation with people we meet, because it is that call of all of us needing to participate to create the change. And as somebody reminded us in our group, that every single act, every little gesture, no matter how small it is, can be an act that Pope Francis says in Laudato Si of love for each other, of love for creation, and of love for our Creator. Simple things that we choose to do, like recycling and taking our own bags shopping rather than getting disposable bags. All of those are gestures and acts of love that we need to keep going with. And then there's the bigger institutional reform changes that we're invited to contribute to. Someone was also saying in the group about writing letters to newspapers by sharing the voice that way, to bring a different approach or a considered integrated approach, putting notices in bulletins at church. All of these little gestures are ways of communicating and sharing the message. And I think that's a good start we can all make too. I wonder if at this point there might be some questions that have come up that we could address, as well as looking at pathways forward from tonight's session before we close with a prayer from Father Mick. So should we go to some questions that might have come up in the chat box? Robbie, is there anything
Yes,
popping
there's
there?
quite a strong theme about the role of Cardinal Pell in promoting denial of climate change, and so a couple of people have asked how you feel about this, and how that sort of perspective challenges the promotion of integral ecology within the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I have worked with Cardinal Pell for some years in terms of working for the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, and it was 10 years, and for most of that time he was in Australia. And what I came to understand is that, you know, as a science educator, as somebody who appreciates and respects scientific inquiry and methodology, we had a difference on that. And I think what's become blatantly clear is that we need to really understand that scientific endeavour helps to reveal God in our world, whether we're looking at it through astrophysics and cosmology, or how plastics break down and researching that so that we can create better forms of use of plastic. There's so many applications of science, and it's really important that just as we understand fields like the arts and humanities and philosophy and theology, that there's respect for science as well. So I think that was one of the major differences that we had, but we absolutely agreed that we needed to be prudent with Earth's resources. that creation is beautiful. It does deserve protection. And so there were points of understanding. But yeah, there's something about being able to hold with respect the differences that we each have in terms of our thinking, in terms of our judgment, and in terms of our action, yet still being able to have respectful, honest dialogue and debate. It doesn't mean that we'll always be able to bring, you know, a persuasive argument that's strong enough to swing people around, but you just never know. And it's worth having it because it causes further thought and reflection, I think. So, yeah, I think that's probably the best way I can respond to that question about the difference of how we feel about science, how we respond to it. And clearly, those who hold a perspective that is different in terms of being a climate denier as such and not believing the science have been shown to be a small percentage of the population. Yes, they've been able to generate a whole lot of communication, and that should put us on our guard to know we need to be able to communicate our way of seeing and feeling and judging about the world to counter that. So, so that's, yeah, that's how I'd like to respond tonight. And
Could I follow up with a
yeah,
further question? One of the strongest themes in Laudato Si is the need to care for the earth and the poor. And often people who focus on economic growth as a means to reduce poverty see that as a point of tension. That is, that the sacrifice that's involved in caring for the earth seems to take away the resources that they would like to apply to reduce poverty through economic growth.
yes, which we understand is a false argument. It's unfortunate, isn't it, that they're often pitted against one another, that it's either jobs or the environment. It's either looking after poor people or the environment. And actually what an integral perspective gives us is an understanding that they're all completely interconnected, and that if we forsake one for the other, we're not making the right judgment call. We actually need to do both and. So it's an inclusive way of seeing the world. It's an inclusive way of responding. And that's very much the understanding that Laudato Si gives us by saying we need to pay attention to both the cry of the earth and the poor. And interestingly, when Pope Francis was asked more about that, he said that he believes the poorest of the poorest of the poorest of the poorest of the poor is Mother Earth. Because, you know, she hasn't got the same voice. She hasn't got the same empathy level as another human being does for each of us, because we can relate more closely to each other than and we know what it is like to be a human on the planet, perhaps more than relating to the pains and the struggles of the earth until we tune into that. So he's really highlighting the fact that we have neglected the earth at our peril, and we really need to get on board with that inclusive way of seeing things. So you're right, we can't afford to continue models of development around looking after the poor that gives them a model that is false as well, in terms of, you know, the huge amount of products needed to be happy. That's obviously flawed. So adjusting our development model is really important at this time as well. And you will probably have noticed how much the Caritas, CAFOD, SIDSE models, which are all those humanitarian aid models in our church who work collaboratively under Caritas Internationalis, have been charged with Laudato Si as being the bodies to take it up with full momentum and force. So there's, you know, it's only been 5 years, we're still seeing that change happen in that rhetoric, in that model of development, and it's coming. And I think even the word development may have been something we've outgrown too in this process, I hope. But that's another conversation for another time. Any other questions there, Robbie?
Sure. Ray has asked, how might we look at spreading the message via the visual senses, for example, textile art, painting, etc.?
this is essential. I think we're all able to be provoked, and art can, and poetry and all those creative parts of expression are something that can really capture our imagination and help us respond with an open heart, with real generosity and love, and shift our thinking and shift our action. And that's often because the feelings that we get by listening to beautiful poetry and music and seeing, you know, creation in its beauty and art that reflects that, evokes something that moves in our guts as well as in our hearts. There's a movement that takes place, and we need to respond to that as creatures. So it goes to the very depths of our feeling space, and it goes to the very openness of our imaginations. So more and more art's required. And sadly, what we're seeing in this time of the COVID pandemic is that the whole arts community is suffering hugely. It's one of the first industries that's been shut down because we can no longer go along to theatre and productions and ballet and, you know, art openings. All the museums have closed. So we do need to rally around the artists in our community, those who are you know, musicians and creative pursuits. And we do need to commission them to do work, I think, that is in response to this call of Laudato Si, in response to the crises we face. It plays a huge part. So let's continue to honour the poets and the musos and all of those who are in our midst and who have been contributing this space, including Indigenous art, which always tells a story about country. You know, we can't go wrong in coming to understand more deeply our relationship with place and country in Australia. That's really, really essential. And reading books about, you know, dark emu that tell us about that incredible way of living that had such diversity in the way it was farmed and housed and lived in, that enabled such an integral ecological way of being. These are the wisdom roots we need to understand. These are the practices that we need to look to help us come out of this spiral of self-destruction that we're part of. So I'd encourage us to go to the arts in every way, and more broadly tap into Indigenous wisdom, perspectives and practice as well. I did say that I'd like to share a little bit about the pathways forward. Perhaps we should go to that because I've noticed the time. Unless there was a burning question that you think needs to be posed, Robbie.
Well, just a suggestion to get something about Laudato Si into Catholic Voice. Maybe that's what you were thinking of talking about.
Well, it had come up in a conversation with Roger and I before the session, and the very first person in my breakout group spoke about how quiet communication has been on Laudato Si since its first launch, and then it's, you know, really something you have to search for. So encouraging it to come through our Catholic communication channels is something we can all do. I know that there's a story in Australian Catholics about this month. Roger and I talked about that. And yeah, please do
The Catholic Daily Voice in
in.
Canberra has been rather silent, but hopefully we'll be able to tap into this forum to get an article through.
Yeah, if you have any ways of doing that, please offer a story, whether you write one about something going on in your community or ask for more to be shared in this way. I think, you know, there's always the opportunity to invite, you know, go into dialogue and invite a response, and to work with people, to offer to collaborate. That's really often key as well, so that you can bring some stories to bear. I think tonight we've talked a bit about the interfaith and the ecumenical being a space for this work to keep growing forth in. there's plenty more that I could say on that, but I also think I should lift up the importance of the voice of youth. I'm sure you've been noticing how Fridays for a Common Future and Fridays for Climate have taken hold with the amazing leadership of Greta Thunberg and the incredible youth response we've had, but a whole community response with parents and grandparents and everybody coming out to respond. This is really, really critical, because I think when we hold that question about what sort of future we're passing on to those who are growing up today, it's not even saying 7 generations ahead, or 11 generations as Japanese traditionally have thought about. It's actually saying the children who are now growing up, what is their future going to be like? If we can hold that thought in mind as we make decisions about our lives, whether it be the next holiday that we're planning to take, or the way in which we're going to choose our food options, any manner of things, then we'll make a wiser choice, I'm convinced, because it helps us to take a long-term approach. It helps us to see the young people in our lives and their future. We can certainly band with them going forward, and we must, in terms of the online campaigning they're doing around climate change, and the Climate Fridays for Future is online. And on Friday just gone, there was a big online forum that we can support with that's going to continue while we're in the lockdown period. Certainly, we've noticed an incredible act of solidarity with young people going into lockdown, losing their capacity to go to school, which the argument, of course, on Fridays when the strike started came out as saying how disruptive it was for young people to do this on a Friday. Couldn't they do it on a Saturday or Sunday? Well, no, that wouldn't have the impact. Clearly, Fridays were chosen for that reason. And now, Fridays not being an anomaly, every school day for the last months has been an act of solidarity with young people, thinking of the older elders in our community in terms of the COVID impact in particular, the most vulnerable who are likely to be affected. And then we see that the older generations, of course, were the ones supporting the young ones in that act. So there's this whole intergenerational solidarity that is going on, and we need to continue that. We need to be part of that, I think, to lift up the voice of young people, and to perhaps encourage them to tell their stories and step into some leadership roles in our church at this time, not just through the youth movement that's going on, but actually in our organisations, in our parishes, and to hear their stories, I think, is really important. There, of course, are other sectors that are getting going with Laudato Si in different ways, whether that be youth and education. There's so many dimensions in health and social services in which all of the responses flow in the economic sector. So we don't have time to explore all of those tonight, but in terms of following up, you know, there are ways of connecting in. So I might just put up some slides to show how that can be connected. So that was our question, of course. Why won't it go forward? I don't know why my slideshow won't roll.
You have to switch out of Zoom and into PowerPoint.
Just while Jacqui's doing that, I might just ask, I noticed Sarah Taitula is still here, and she's working with the education of youth, and she's currently working at ACU. So just wanted to acknowledge that work, Sarah.
Great. Sarah, I'm at ACU in North Sydney for this conference tonight, so perhaps we should connect up as well. I've got some slides here. I'm just attempting to, in a very poor way, put them up. Hopefully they'll come up now. So this is an example of that action I was talking about in solidarity with our youngsters. But also on climate, you know, we had a huge turnout for our recent climate marches. I think there were 47 climate marches across Australia, and voices of faith are growing in these events, and I'd encourage us all to walk together in supporting that. Some other actions that you can take, obviously reading Laudato Si is important. There's so much wisdom in there. It doesn't matter how often I dip into it, I'm always so delighted to discover what's there. It's such a long document with so much richness. Encouraging others to read it is a great thing to do. Showing some videos on it. There's one's pitched for youngsters. There's also a 3.5-minute video that you can play in the homily time that's based on Australia through Catholic Earth Care that I made when it first came out, which still has the right message in it for today, 5 years on. Oh, I've done it again, Robbie. I've somehow gone into Zoom. Anyway, join the Catholic Climate Movement if you would like to take the Laudato Si pledge. You can celebrate Laudato Si Week, which is a phenomenon this year and it will be next year. We've actually got a whole Laudato Si year ahead, and you can you can start up something called a Laudato Si Circle, and there's resources that are sent out each month to assist with prayer, with reflection, with dialogue and with action. There's a whole raft of things on the Global Catholic Climate Movement website that come out, whether it's around Lent and of course Advent. There's different resources for sectors as well. So check that out if you're looking for more and ways
Jacqui,
of connecting.
we'd be happy at in our archdiocese, the South Belconnen Parish Circle would be happy to work with other groups who wish to establish a circle in other parishes.
Great, because the Listen Circle that you've started is ecumenical with Indigenous wisdom in dialogue, which I think is wonderful. And then you've got the South Belconnen Parish and this initiative which has come out, supported by Father Simon. So I think, you know, you've got a great model with which to work, and tapping into these resources doesn't have to be in any prescriptive way. It's just however it's going to work for your context, and it can be just private prayers at home, whatever suits you as well. And of course, I'd like to highlight the season of creation, which each year has more and more momentum. Ecumenically, it's always acknowledged at Assisi in Italy, and there's resources that you can tap into through the website for that. There's also Catholic resources that come out for the season of creation. So please do tap into those, and feel free to start preparing for the season of creation in advance, letting your liturgists know that there's resources that they can use, your parish priests having access to the homily reflections that are always really well written in light of the gospel that year, or this year and each year. So there's some of the ways to think about going forward. Staying tuned and keeping in touch may be also a really good way through what Roger has set up with this group as well. One last thing, on World Environment Day coming up, we're going to be hosting an Oceania dialogue. So the invitation is there for anybody who'd like to join that, and I'll send the invitation to Roger, to you through Roger. It's on Friday the 5th of June, so it's in a couple of weeks. And at the moment, it looks like we'll have a partnership launch of the Brisbane Archdiocese with the Archdiocese of Suva, with Archbishop Chong and the Bishops of Brisbane. We're also inviting Cardinal Rabat from Papua New Guinea, and all the animators. There's an animator program, a Laudato Si animator program that happens twice a year through GCCM. The Oceania participants of the animator program will be invited. So there'll be a couple of hundred people in the Zoom call that you might like to join in that day as well, because we know it's important that we reflect on this new invitation from the dicastery that's just come out the special anniversary year. How we live into this, I think, really matters, and being able to tap into it for our local context, our regional context of Oceania, and the international community to go forward, I think is an opportunity as well. So feel free to come along to that Zoom call in a couple of weeks. So I'd like to say a big word of thanks to Roger for organising this and Tuesday night's gathering. I know he's done a lot of homework to get up to speed on how to host on Zoom. You've done an amazing job, Roger. We're so thrilled to come together with you and this community tonight. And I'd also like to say a special thanks to Father Simon Falk, who has been the host of these two gatherings, for encouraging the process that you have for this to happen, to be the centre of the parish leader, constantly enabling new things to emerge like this. We thank you. It's a real gift, and without it, tonight wouldn't have been possible. So now I'd like to invite Father Mick to lead us in closing prayer, unless there's anything more you'd like to say, Roger.
No, but I might put Father Mick on speaker view for this part of the proceedings.
Wonderful, thanks so much.
On behalf of everyone, I would just like to thank Roger and Jacqui for the opportunity to come together over Zoom, and it certainly reinvigorated my understanding of the need to really make parishioners aware of Laudato Si. Let's pray now in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Psalm 8 says, "What are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Yet you have made them a little lower than a god, and crowned them with glory and honour." Lord, we do have your eyes. Help us to take the blindfolds off so that we can see what has become of our common home. Your ears are our ears. Help us take the earplugs out so we can hear the cries of our common home. Your voice is our voice. Let us take the gags off ourselves and really proclaim to all the world how we can care for our common home. Help us through your Holy Spirit to be your faith-filled apostles of good news for all of our common home. Amen.
Amen. Thanks so much, Father Mick. What a beautiful prayer. I'd love you to share that with us. If you have it written down, that would be wonderful. I'm sure it can be something we can continue to pray, because it's incredibly animating. Thank you. Well, Roger, I think we're at the end of our session tonight. Is it time to say goodbye?
Yes, except I think we also owe you a debt of gratitude, and thank you for your generosity with your time with us. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's been lovely to see your faces tonight. Thank you for the claps. These claps are for you too. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Robbie, for your awesome help with the questions. And I hope you all have the wonderful end to the Laudato Si week and a great beginning to this Laudato Si year together. God bless you all.
God bless you too, Jacqui.
Jacqui.
Thank you. Amen. Alleluia.